the globe. According to the theory of evolution, all beings evolve over the course of generations through a process of natural selection. Adaptation is the mechanism whereby an organism becomes better suited to deal with changing habitats. As a species, human beings have now reached a critical juncture. We have entered the age of adaptation.
In the midst of a serious financial crisis.
An economic crisis of global scope.
Pour que la crise ne fasse pas souffrir davantage les entreprises du CAC 40.
The crisis that occurred in the United States may have an impact that will affect the whole world.
The speed of the crisis development beats every record.
There is no one country that can solve this crisis on its own.
It constitutes a full-blown crisis.
Our leaders acted immediately to respond to the economic crisis, yet international plans to tackle climate change have always been delayed. Indeed, our model of development is based on systematic exploitation of natural resources. We do not create wealth, we simply turn natural resources into money. In doing so, we have inflated our planet with carbon dioxide, thinking that sooner or later it would go away, but it didn't work.
Most of our activity, because it's fossil fuel powered, must be unsustainable. It can't continue forever. We can't continue to find fossil fuel forever. And even if we could, there's now deep concerns that the climate, the atmosphere, cannot assimilate that level of waste.
In the past century, most countries have developed by increasing their level of CO2 emissions due to the exploitation of natural resources. Since the 1950s, developing countries as well have embraced the same approach, thereby emitting growing quantities of CO2 before being able to see progress in terms of national wealth. The rationale behind this process was the complete trust and continuous economic growth represented by one single indicator, the gross domestic product, also known as GDP. The GDP was invented in the 1940s to measure the value of goods and services produced in a country. Ever since, politicians have spread the mantra of GDP as the supreme goal of social and economic development. From industrialized nations, this enthusiasm rapidly spread to developing countries.
We'd have to make the country grow. And that is exactly what is happening in Brazil.
Our GDP grew by 9%. When China, a large developing country, runs its affairs well, it can help restore confidence in global economic growth.
That the long-term outlook for India's economy remains strong and robust, a 9% growth trajectory.
But what does GDP tell us about well-being? Simon Kuznets, the economist who developed the GDP formula, was the first one to warn against misusing his indicator. He argued that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income, and that distinctions must be kept in mind between quantity and quality of growth. More growth of what and for what?
If GDP is what we think is success, people will strive for GDP. And political leaders all the time say, look at what we've done. They always put it, I've succeeded in getting the economy to grow at 6%. Now, what he did is hard to figure out, but that's the politician does that. I've created X million jobs. So that's part of the political rhetoric. The question is, by doing that, they focus policies on things that will increase GDP.
Occasionally, though, some have criticized the GDP fever and the illusion of infinite growth.
Too much and for too long, we seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. That gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwoods and the loss of our natural wonders in chaotic sprawl. It counts napalm, and it counts nuclear warheads and armored cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities. It counts Whitman's rifle and Speck's knife, and the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile.
Even though it does not measure real well-being, GDP has now acquired a life of its own. In its name, the world has been pushing economic growth at all costs by depleting the planet's natural resources, most of which come from poor countries in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. If our world were a country, it would be one of the most unjust in history. 1.5 billion people live on less than $1 a day. 10 million die every year of hunger. Rising food prices may push 100 million people deeper into poverty. Meanwhile, we are making our planet even hotter through our habits of consumption. So we further contribute to climate change, thereby endangering our natural world and the ecosystem in which we live.
When I was growing up, the whole village was forested. We had thick forests that as kids we are scared to get inside. Now, when I look back many years later, all this have disappeared. The many streams, the many springs, the many rivers that we used to swim in as children are all gone.
The greenhouse effect caused by CO2 emissions has wreaked havoc with our climate. In the past 5 years, the number of natural disasters has increased by over 38 times if compared to the beginning of the 20th century. Besides floods, droughts, and other natural disasters, changing weather patterns affect our ability to grow food and access drinking water. In turn, this makes people more vulnerable and increases the likelihood of famine and conflict.
Farmers can no longer predict, rain periods. In the past, they would prepare, their fields. With that accuracy, and it will normally coincide with the rains. This time they have to gamble, So it's not uncommon to see farmers, divide their seeds, during planting time and just plant half of it and hold back to see what happens. But will the rains come on time or will they? Because if they plant everything at the same time and it goes, again, linked to poverty, it's really quite a complicated issue. So people are confused, they can no longer predict, and things are quite different.
We must be able to connect the dots. The economic crunch, increasing poverty and inequality, and climate change are converging into a systemic crisis, resulting from the pursuit of infinite growth that our development model dictates. These crises are closely connected, and more worryingly, they're mutually reinforcing. We know that this process is not sustainable, and yet we try our best to avoid changing our development model. We want to believe there can be technical solutions to address these convergent crises. Advertisers have quickly caught on to the growing concern of consumers to reduce their environmental impact. A new commercial rhetoric is being used to promote technological remedies to address ecological degradation. Climate change has quickly become a new business.
I believe in the future.
In the future.
I believe in protecting the environment.
I believe in energy independence.
I believe we can limit greenhouse gases and keep energy cost affordable.
I believe in technology.
Brings out the best in us.
We will do this.
I believe. I believe.
I believe.
We can be energy independent. We can continue to use our most abundant fuel cleanly and responsibly. We can, we will. Clean coal. Clean coal. Clean coal.
Some people believe and look for the techno fix.
Exactly.
And rather than changing behavior and rethinking the way we live, we're still hanging out for the techno fix, the technological solution that will simply allow us to carry on and solve our problems. I'm not a great believer in the techno fix.
The most popular techno fix is probably carbon offsetting, a service available to private companies and individuals alike. Thousands of new websites have sprung up on the internet, promising to develop mechanisms that will offset the personal carbon footprint of their clients. These websites help you calculate your environmental footprint and then offer the possibility to neutralize it by purchasing specific services, ranging from investments in renewable energies to planting trees. These services are usually quite cheap, and for a few tens of dollars, they provide a rather easy way to make consumers feel less responsible for emissions caused by their last holidays, their daily electricity consumption, and their commute to work.
These days, it seems like almost everyone has started making some changes towards a more eco-friendly life. And at BEF, we can help you discover even more simple ways to soften your impact. But we also realize that reducing our carbon footprint only goes part of the way to a truly clean lifestyle. That's why we've developed our Carbon Offsets program. At BEF, we view a carbon offset as an investment in clean energy. Because burning fossil fuels for energy is the main cause of global warming, we decided to focus our efforts there, at the root of the problem. It's actually quite simple. Your carbon offset allows you to make an important decision: dirty fossil fuels or clean energy. Finally, you have a choice, just like you can choose between fuel-efficient or gas-guzzling vehicles. When you take responsibility for your carbon footprint, the funds go directly to build BEF's wind and solar projects. And when we produce clean energy and feed it into the system, or energy pool, the dirty, non-renewable sources are scaled back as wind and solar take over, which means less carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Changing the way we create energy is the most meaningful way to slow down and eventually stop climate change. This is an evolution of the way we live on our planet that cannot wait. Offsets give us the power to choose this change right now. BEF also guarantees that your support of clean energy is money properly spent. Green E, a national third-party certification, ensures that we deliver what we say we will deliver.
If you fly from here back to Europe, well, that takes about 24 hours to get there, and the carbon is emitted over that 24-hour period. When you buy an offset, which might be somebody planting some trees on your behalf, well, the question you have to ask yourself is over how long a period is the carbon in the offset going to take to sequestrate your 24 hours of emitting behavior? Very few people buy enough trees to be planted that will offset the carbon in a 24-hour period. Very few people actually buy enough offset to plant trees for 1 year to offset that 24 hours of activity. And if you only buy a few trees, it may take 100 years, or whatever the growth period of those trees are before they reach maturity, to offset that 24-hour activity. And the question you have to ask is, what did you do the next day? Did you emit no carbon the next day for the next 100 years while your trees grow? Of course not. So the danger is that the offsetting behavior will never keep up with and never catch up with your emitting activity. So unless you can systematically find other ways of reducing carbon in your emitting activities, or any GHG, the tree planting is never going to be sufficient.
Planting trees to capture carbon is quite easy, but presents several problems. Trees have to be protected throughout their whole natural life, after which timber has to be stored properly so that it does not decompose, releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. At the moment, wind turbines and solar panels are produced by using energy from fossil fuels, and in the short run, sharp growth in the production of these tools might increase the level of CO2. Therefore, carbon offsetting has been criticized by many with scientific arguments and by some with irony.
And what we do is cheat offsetting. So if you're in a relationship, or you're lucky enough to be with someone, and for whatever reason something goes a little bit wrong, one of you does something that you probably shouldn't have done.
Happens quite often.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, what you can do is you can come to us and pay us a small amount of money. And what we do is we take that money and we invest it in couples like yourselves who are faithful to each other, and that way we can neutralise the damage that you've done to your relationship.
All we're doing is taking this well-established concept of carbon offsetting and moving it into the arena of cheating. Carbon offsetting doesn't provide us with a solution to climate change, and it in fact delays people in making real changes in their lifestyles. And the longer we put off those changes, the harder it's going to be to make them, the more damaging and the more destructive it's going to be when we do eventually have to move to this low carbon economy.
If you depicted it as a caricature, you have a sort of rather indulgent, overfed, fat Westerner buying offsets, thinking they're doing a great thing, and then there's some poor African being displaced from their land in order to put in a monoculture forest so the Westerners can carry on their activity. So there's a real justice issue in here that often doesn't surface necessarily.
Based on the Kyoto Protocol, the European system of cap and trade is considered the most advanced policy to curb climate change. It is an administrative approach used to control CO2 emissions by providing allowances to firms and companies and then let the market regulate how these credits can be traded. However, this system reveals the same shortcomings as the carbon offset principle. How are allowances established? How does one make sure they do not become permissions to pollute? Unfortunately, contradictions are quite common in the European context. Recently, the European Union has approved new drilling in the Arctic, following the pressure of oil companies interested in exploiting the new possibilities offered by melting ice caps to establish oil fields at the North Pole.
Remember, is that the underlying philosophy here is to create a market that allows people to trade carbon credits, that will create a price for carbon, that will then create a incentive for conventional activities, if you like, to decarbonize or take the carbon out of their systems. And the price of carbon creates that incentive. But the market will also create the possibility where you have just pure traders that buy and sell credits to try and make money out of them.
As long as we refuse to recognize that climate change is simply revealing the unsustainability and profound injustice of our development model, we will not be able to address the systemic crisis the world is facing. State policies, market dynamics, and technological innovation can surely help, but only if they become part of a general revolution of our way of life.
Changing faster than people can cope, so it's creating more vulnerability. Now we see longer dry spells or heavier rainfalls. Like in Kenya, where I come from, you can split the country into two. The northern half is really suffers from long droughts or very biting droughts. Now, when there's no drought, then there are very severe floods. In western parts of Kenya, we have perennial floods, which people can no longer predict anymore.
More cyclones will be generated, and they will be generated earlier in the season, and they will be also generated further south, further away from the equator.
Climate change is no longer just a possibility. It is happening everywhere. A recent study by the British charity Oxfam reports that the number of people affected by climate-related disasters will rise by over 50% in the next 5 years. The Global Humanitarian Forum, a think tank run by Kofi Annan, estimates that climate change is responsible for 300,000 deaths every year, and that this number could grow more than twofold by 2030. There are two types of responses to counter the climate crisis: mitigation of the effects and adaptation to change. Since 2000, when the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, CO2 emissions have not decreased. On the contrary, they have continued growing and climate change has accelerated its pace. To mitigate climate change, our governments should have acted much sooner and more aggressively. As a result, human beings are now left with essentially one option: adapt.
For many centuries, people have adapted to the physical climate in which they find themselves. I think this is just happening so rapidly now that people struggle to keep up. That they are also probably finding themselves in a situation where they're not quite sure how exactly do they go about to adapt. What will the future hold? If they adapt, let's say, just agricultural practices, today, in 5 years' time, what new adaptation do they need to do? And I think that's uncertainty where people are very cautious, because in many cases this is the livelihood of many communities.
The process of adaptation will not only affect poor countries, it will have an impact on rich countries too. Since 1999, the NATO military alliance has been developing strategies to deal with the new phenomenon of environmental security. In April 2009, the European Union has further integrated its approach for adaptation to climate change. According to the EU, climate change will bring longer and drier summers, leading to more use of air conditioning, thereby creating heavy temporary demand for electricity. 1 billion people may be forced to move between now and 2050, in a dire global crisis with more far-reaching consequences than the aftermath of World War II. Floods are already Europe's costliest natural catastrophe, but a more devastating long-term threat is the complete collapse of the Greenland ice sheet, which would cause a 7-meter sea level rise, thus destroying major cities like London and Amsterdam. Because of rising sea levels, some of the most beautiful European cities might disappear in the next decades. Development model based on continuous economic growth has left the planet with a systemic crisis of rising poverty, unstable economies, and global ecological disaster. Our planet is a universe of unique beauty and renewable energy, which makes human life possible. To recreate all processes that nature offers us for free, from water flows to pollination, we would need to spend more than 1,000 times the global economy. Who can afford that?
Carry on the way we are, we'll pick the earth bare of resource and make the atmosphere so badly polluted that we simply can't continue the way we are.
So there's actually a moral responsibility by the international community. So I think the moral responsibility of the international community combined with homegrown solutions, looking again at the coping strategies and how we can fill in the gaps, I think we really need a concerted effort.
There are no alternatives to adaptation, but we can still decide how to adapt. There are two possible scenarios. We can continue with our development model based on economic growth and prepare for the worst, or we can view climate change as a warning, as the final evidence of the deep injustices that ravage our societies. Perhaps this might be our last chance.